The morning mist clung to Monaco's asphalt like a warning. May 23rd, 1984. I was 24, driving for Toleman, a team most paddock insiders wrote off as amateur hour. But standing in our cramped garage, watching rain hammer the circuit with increasing violence, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not fear. I made peace with fear years ago. This was recognition. Ayrton, visibility's down to 50 meters, Pat Simons said, clutching a soggy weather report. The big teams are talking about red flagging practice. I stepped to the garage entrance and held out my hand. The raindrops hit like bullets. In that moment, I closed my eyes and did what I'd done since my karting days in Sao Paulo, something nobody in the paddock knew about. I prayed. Not Sunday morning church prayers, but something raw, personal. Give me clarity to see what others cannot, I whispered in Portuguese. Give me courage to go where they won't. When I opened my eyes, the track had transformed. What others saw as chaos, I saw as opportunity. The standing water wasn't an obstacle. It was my advantage. Senna, Alex Hawkridge, our team manager, approached with uncharacteristic worry creasing his face. The other drivers are calling impossible. Prost people want to cancel. Even Lauda is shaking his head. Alain Prost, the professor, the man who calculated every risk, every angle, every possibility before making his move. I'd studied him religiously since arriving in Formula One, memorizing his precision, his methodical brilliance. Three-time world champion, master of racecraft. But today, I sensed calculation won't be enough. I walked to my Toleman TG 184. She wasn't much, a heart-turbo engine wrapped in hope and determination. In dry conditions, we scraped for points while McLaren and Ferrari fought for wins. But running my hand along her nose cone, I felt that connection every real driver knows. Man and machine, becoming something more than the sum of their parts. Tell me about the car, I said to Pat. Not built for this, he admitted, adjusting rain-fogged glasses. Aerodynamics can't match McLaren or Ferrari. We're down on power against the Renaults. But she's light, responsive, in the right hands. In the right hands. My father's words echoed from my childhood at Interlagos when I was 8 years old and tearing around that little karting track. Bico, he'd said, using my nickname, anyone can press a throttle. Racing is about seeing what others miss, feeling what they can't feel. I climbed into the cockpit, the familiar embrace of carbon fiber and determination. Steering wheel in my hands, pedals at my feet. This was my sanctuary. I took 3 deep breaths, my pre-race ritual, and visualized the track. Not Monaco as it existed in sunshine, but Monaco as it would be in 20 minutes. I could see the racing line nobody else would find, patches of grip where conventional wisdom said none existed. Casino Square's a treacherous exit, the tunnel's disorienting light changes, to back corner where one mistake meant disaster. All of it mapped in my mind with crystalline clarity. Radio check, came Pat's voice through the intercom. Copy, I replied. My voice sounded different. Calmer. Focused beyond normal human parameters. Other drivers emerged from their garages, and their uncertainty was visible. These were men who'd conquered every circuit on Earth, faced death, and won. But today they looked mortal. Alain climbed into his McLaren MP4 and 2. Even from 50 meters away, I read his body language. Cautious, analytical, he'd approached this session like everything else. Methodical precision, calculated risk. World Championship strategy. But I had a feeling methodology wouldn't cut it today. Niki Lauda settled into the sister McLaren. The man who'd survived the Nürburgring inferno returned torusing with burns still healing on his scarred face. If anyone understood pushing beyond human limits, it was Niki. But watching him now, I saw something unprecedented in his movements. Not fear. Niki was incapable of conventional fear, but recognition that today might demand something even his legendary courage couldn't provide. Rain pounded harder, creating rivers across the track surface. Mechanics scrambled through the polyglot chaos of Formula One, shouting in English, Italian, French, German, mixing with the storm's roar. Ayrton, my teammate Johnny Ciccato approached, helmet under his arm, expression grave. 15 years of racing, never seen conditions like this. You sure we should go out there? I looked at Johnny, veteran, respected throughout the paddock for consistent performance and unwavering professionalism. If he had doubts, the conditions were truly extraordinary. Sometimes we're called to do impossible things, I said, conviction building in my voice. Not to prove something to others, to prove something to ourselves. He nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. This wasn't about championship points or proving Toleman belonged with McLaren and Ferrari. This was fundamental. What it meant to be a racing driver at absolute edge. All drivers to grid. Practice begins in 10 minutes. I pulled on my helmet. The world sharpened, became intimate. Rain sounds muffled through carbon fiber and fire-resistant layers. But I still felt the storm's energy, still sensed nature's raw power about to become me partner. The Toleman's engine fired behind me. Familiar adrenaline surge mixed with something deeper, destiny. Not manufactured drama journalist love, but something real, profound. Today will be different. Everything I'd learned, felt, dreamed about racing would converge in one perfect moment. Pittsburgh lane opened. One by one, the world's greatest drivers headed into conditions that would ground commercial aircraft. Other teams had backup cars, unlimited budgets, factory support. We had talent, determination, and faith that sometimes that's enough. I took one final breath and prepared to show them what happened when human will met divine inspiration on motorsport's most unforgiving stage. Monaco waited. Rain fell, and I was about to discover how far beyond impossible a man could reach when everything aligned in perfect harmony. The first car ahead disappeared into the gray void. Then another. My turn approached. In 30 seconds, I would either validate everything I believed about racing, about myself, about the thin line between dreams and reality, or I would join the long list of drivers who discover their limits in the most humbling way possible. The pit lane exit loomed through my visor like the entrance to another world. A world where normal rules didn't apply, where only pure instinct and unwavering faith could guide you through. I pressed the throttle and entered that world, leaving behind everything safe and predictable. Monaco in the rain was about to teach us all what impossible really meant. The pit lane exit vanished behind me as I accelerated into what could only be described as automotive purgatory. The spray from the car ahead, I think it was Bautzon's arrows, hit my visor like a gray tsunami, instantly reducing my world to a cocoon of roaring engine noise and a hypnotic rhythm off-rain hammering my helmet. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 meters. In some corners, less. This was where most drivers would lift off, ease back, survive. I pressed harder. The first corner approached through the murk. I could barely make out the barriers, but I didn't need to see them. I could feel their presence, sense their exact location through some primitive radar that lived in my bones. The Toleman responded like a living thing, dancing through standing water that should have sent us spinning into the Armco. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of carbon fiber meeting concrete. Someone had found the barriers at Saint Devote. Through my mirrors, what little I could see through the spray, I caught a glimpse of yellow and blue. A Williams, maybe Rosberg, spinning helplessly before disappearing into the gray void. Senna, that's Kiki off at turn 1. Pat's voice crackled through the radio. Red flags coming any second. But there was no red flag. Race direction was letting us continue into this beautiful madness, and I felt something inside me respond like a tuning fork struck at perfect pitch. While others fought the conditions, I was beginning to understand them. The climb toward Casino Square was treacherous in the wet, but as I approached the braking zone, it discovered something extraordinary. Where the racing line normally ran, polished smooth by countless practice sessions, the track was like ice. But 6 inches to the left, where no one ever drove, where rubber and oil had never accumulated, there was grip. Real, honest grip that felt like a gift from the racing gods themselves. I moved the car into this virgin territory and felt it bite, felt it hold, felt it respond with a precision that defied every law of wet weather racing I'd ever learned. My lap time flashed on the dashboard, already 3 seconds faster than my previous best in these conditions. And I was just getting started. Through Casino Square, past the Mirabeau, down toward the harbor section where the spray would be at its worst. The car ahead of me, Patrese in the Alfa Romeo, was struggling, weaving slightly as he fought for grip on the conventional racing line. I could see his uncertainty in the way he positioned his car, hesitant, defensive. I pulled alongside him on the inside, finding grip where he saw only water. His helmet turned toward me as I passed, and I could imagine his expression. A Toleman? Here? Already? The harbor chicane was a nightmare of spray and confused trajectories, cars everywhere and nowhere, appearing and disappearing like ghosts in the storm. But I was beginning to see patterns in the chaos, reading the spray signatures like a map. Heavy spray meant a car was fighting the track, creating turbulence. Light spray meant someone had found a line, was working with the conditions instead off against them. I was creating almost no spray at all. Lap after lap, I began to understand Monaco in the rain like I'd never understood it before. Each corner revealed new secrets, new paths through the deluge that others simply couldn't see. The tunnel section, usually disorienting with its dramatic light change, became a refuge. The track was drier there, protected from the worst of the downpour, and I could push harder while others remained tentative. Jesus Christ, I heard someone say over the radio. Not my radio, but the frequency was bleeding through. It sounded like one of the McLaren engineers. Look at the timing screens. I was moving up, not gradually, not carefully, but systematically dismantling the field with each passing lap. Cars that should have been out of my league, the Ferraris, the Renaults, even some of the McLarens, were falling behind as I found speed in places where speed shouldn't exist. Past to back, where the barriers came uncomfortably close and the margin for error disappeared entirely. A moment's hesitation here could end your race, your season, possibly your career. But I wasn't hesitating. The car felt like an extension of my nervous system, responding to thoughts before they fully formed in me conscious mind. I caught and passed Warwick's Renault with an overtake that surprised even me. Coming out of Thekakane, where the track widened slightly, I saw a line on the outside that conventional wisdom said would be awash with standing water. But something told me to try it. The Toleman held, gripped, and shot past the Renault like it was tied to the track. Where the hell did that come from? I could hear Derek Warwick's frustration bleeding through the radio chatter. The paddock was taking notice. Through the static and engine noise, I could hear fragments off commentary, team radio transmissions, the barely controlled excitement of people witnessing something they'd never expected to see. A Toleman in the points positions. A Toleman running with the leaders. By lap 15, I had worked my way up to 8th position. Cars worth 10 times what Toleman spent on development were behind me, their drivers struggling to comprehend how a Brazilian kid in an underfunded British car was finding speed they couldn't access. Ayrton, Pat's voice carried a note of disbelief. You're running faster than anyone. Faster than Prost. Faster than Lauda. The timing computers think there's a malfunction. But there was no malfunction. There was only the gradual revelation of something I had always suspected but never fully understood. That in extreme conditions, when the normal rules break down, when technology reaches its limits, it comes down to something more primitive. Instinct. Faith. The willingness to trust in forces beyond calculation. Ahead of me, I could see the distinctive yellow helmet of René Arnoux in the Ferrari. A man who had won races, stood on podiums, commanded respect throughout the paddock. And I was gaining on him with each corner, each perfect line through the impossible conditions. The crowd in the grandstands, what few spectators had braved the weather, were on their feet. I could sense their excitement even through the storm, feel their amazement as this unknown quantity in an unfancied car continued to defy everything they thought they knew about Formula One hierarchy. But this was only the beginning. I could feel something building inside me, something that went beyond mere pace or car control. It was as if the storm was calling to a part of me I'd never fully accessed before, inviting me to push beyond the boundaries of what anyone thought possible. The McLarens were still ahead, their superior aerodynamics and ground effect giving them advantages even in these conditions. But they were no longer disappearing into the distance. I was hunting them down, closing the gap with each lap, and I could sense their drivers beginning to glance in their mirrors with something approaching concern. Alain Prost, the master of wet weather racing, was about to discover that his student had been taking notes in a classroom he'd never imagined existed. As I approached the tunnel for what felt like the 100th time, spray cascading off my helmet like a waterfall, I realized I was no longer driving a Formula One car through a rainstorm. I was conducting a symphony of physics and faith, each note perfect, each movement inevitable. And the music was just beginning to build toward its crescendo. Behind me, the field was spreading out as drivers found their limits and settled into survival mode. Ahead of me, the true giants of the sport were about to learn that sometimes the impossible becomes inevitable when human potential meets perfect conditions for transcendence. I was running fifth now and climbing. The Toleman felt lighter with each lap, more responsive, as if it too was being lifted by whatever force was carrying us both beyond the realm of normal automotive physics. Monaco in the rain was about to crown a new master, and nobody, least of all me, was quite ready for what came next. Lap 22. I swept past Nigel Mansell's Lotus with an overtaking move that shouldn't have been possible. The inside line at Rascasse, where standing water normally meant certain death, had become Mipravate Highway. The Lotus, with its superior ground effect and Colin Chapman engineering legacy, fell behind like it was anchored to the track. Third place. The grandstands erupted. Even through my helmet, through the engine noise and rain, I could hear the crowd's roar shifting from polite applause to something bordering on hysteria. 20,000 people were witnessing the impossible unfold in real time, and their collective disbelief was becoming a tangible force in the Monaco air. Senna, you're running third. Pat's voice carried an edge of barely controlled amazement. The McLaren boys are asking race control about track conditions. They want to know if this is safe to continue. Safe. The word almost made me smile. What was happening to me had moved beyond the realm of safety and into something far more dangerous, the territory where human potential touches divinity. I wasn't driving the Toleman anymore. The car was responding to intentions I hadn't even fully formed, reacting to racing lines I could see but couldn't explain. In the McLaren pit, I could imagine the chaos. Ron Dennis, the team principal who had built the most dominant Formula One operation in history, watching a kid in a backmarker car demolish everything head-hot he knew about racing hierarchy. His engineers would be checking their timing equipment, convinced there had to be some malfunction, some explanation for what their data was telling them. But there was no malfunction. There was only the gradual recognition that sometimes the universe conspires to create perfect moments, and those moments don't always respect team budgets or technical superiority. The rain was getting heavier, if such a thing was possible. What had started as a downpour was becoming biblical, turning Monaco into an aquatic nightmare that should have been red flagged hours ago. But race control was hesitating, caught between their obligation to safety and their recognition that they might be witnessing something unprecedented. I could feel their uncertainty radiating from race control's tower, could sense the heated discussions taking place in air-conditioned offices while we battled for survival on track. The big teams would be applying pressure. McLaren, Ferrari, Renault, their millions of dollars in development being nullified by a 24-year-old Brazilian in a car held together by hope and determination. This is madness, I heard someone say over the radio frequencies. It might have been Niki Lauda's engineer, or maybe Ron Dennis himself. Nobody should be going that fast in these conditions. But I wasn't going fast. Speed was a crude concept, a blunt instrument. What I was doing transcended speed and entered the realm of pure physics harmony. Every input to the steering wheel, every pressure on the throttle, every line through the corners was happening without conscious thought, as if some deeper intelligence was piloting the Toleman while my conscious mind observed in wonder. Ahead of me, running second, was Niki Lauda in the McLaren MP4 and 2, the man who had come back from the dead at Nürburgring, whose courage was legendary throughout the sport. But I could see uncertainty in his driving line, could read the hesitation in his braking points. The rain was asking questions that even Niki's experience couldn't answer. I closed on him through the harbor section, finding grip in places where physics textbooks said grip couldn't exist. The Toleman moved through the standing water like it had been designed specifically for these conditions, while the McLaren, with all its aerodynamic sophistication, struggled to maintain stability. At the chicane, I pulled alongside Niki on the outside. For a moment, we ran wheel to wheel through the spray, two cars separated by maybe 18 inches and 20 years of racing evolution. His helmet turned toward me, and I could imagine his eyes widening as he recognized the impossible reality unfolding beside him. I completed the pass before the tunnel entrance, the Toleman's lighter weight allowing it to change direction with a precision that left the McLaren behind. Second place in a Formula One race. In Monaco, in conditions that were making legends of wet weather driving look like Sunday morning drivers. The crowd was on its feet now, their applause audible even over the storm. In the press box, journalists were abandoning their prepared stories, scrambling to capture something none of them had expected to witness. This wasn't just an upset. This was a fundamental challenge to everything Formula One represented about money, technology, and hierarchy. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph came a voice with an Irish accent over the radio. The Toleman boy just passed Lauda in the wet at Monaco, but ahead of me, still running first, was the ultimate challenge. Alain Prost in the leading McLaren, the man they called the professor, the master of calculated perfection who had turned wet weather driving into a science. For seconds ahead, but I was gaining with every corner, every perfect line through the impossible conditions. In the McLaren pit, I could imagine the conversations taking place. Engineers checking and rechecking their data, unable to process what they were seeing. A Toleman, a team that struggled to score points under conditions, was not just competing with but actively hunting down their world champion driver. The political implications were staggering. Formula One was built on a foundation of technical and financial superiority. The big teams spent millions developing advantages measured in hundreds of seconds, employed hundreds of engineers to squeeze every fraction of performance from their cars. And here I was, in a car assembled on a budget smaller than McLaren's catering expenses, making their technological superiority irrelevant. I could sense the discomfort radiating from the establishment. This wasn't how the script was supposed to read. Young drivers were supposed to serve their apprenticeships, learn their place, gradually work their way up the hierarchy through years of patience and political maneuvering. They weren't supposito appear from nowhere and challenge the natural order with nothing but pure, undiluted talent. The gap to Prost closed to 3 seconds. Then 2. The crowd noise was becoming overwhelming, a crescendo of disbelief that seemed to be willing me forward through sheer collective amazement. In the Toleman pit, Alex Hawkridge and the mechanics were standing transfixed, watching their timing screens like men witnessing a miracle. But the real miracle wasn't happening on the timing screens. It was happening inside me, in the space between conscious thought and pure instinct, where racing drivers occasionally discover they can touch something beyond human limitation. The Toleman had stopped feeling like a machine and started feeling like a direct extension of my nervous system, responding to intentions before they fully formed in my mind. Through to back, where the barriers waited with patient malevolence, I found a line so perfect, so precise, that the car seemed to dance through the corner without touching the standing water. Behind me, I knew other drivers were shaking their heads, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing in their mirrors. 1 second behind Prost now, the greatest wet weather driver of our generation. The man who had won races in conditions that defeated everyone else was about to discover that sometimes perfection is centeno. Sometimes the universe demands transcendence, and transcendence doesn't respect reputation or experience or technical superiority. I could feel it building inside me, something beyond confidence, beyond skill, beyond anything I had ever experienced before. The next few laps would either confirm my place among the legends of this sport or teach me the hardest lesson about the difference between dreams and reality. But as I closed within striking distance of Prost McLaren, as the rain continued to fall like judgment from heaven, I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't about to learn about limitations. I was about to teach the world about the difference between the possible and the inevitable. The stage was set. The storm was reaching its crescendo. And somewhere in the space between human ambition and divine intervention, Ayrton Senna was about to discover exactly what he was capable of when everything, skill, faith, courage, and pure will, aligned in perfect harmony. Alain Prost's mirrors were about to frame the face of his successor. 1 second. In Formula One terms, an eternity. In human terms, a heartbeat. In spiritual terms, the space between mortality and transcendence. I was 1 second behind Alain Prost, and that second contained everything I had ever learned about racing, about faith, about the difference between what we think is possible and what the universe occasionally allows us to achieve. The spray from his McLaren painted abstract patterns across my visor, but I wasn't seeing the spray anymore. I was seeing through it, around it, into dimensions of perception that had nothing to do with normal human sight. Every droplet of water carried information about grip levels, about wind patterns, about the exact trajectory Alain would take through the next sequence of corners. He was driving perfectly. That was the terrifying beauty of what I was witnessing. This wasn't a struggling driver making mistakes I could exploit. This was Alain Prost at his absolute peak, the master craftsman applying every lesson learned from years of conquering impossible conditions. His lines were textbook perfect, his braking points calculated with mathematical precision, his throttle application as smooth as silk. And it wasn't enough. Lap 27. Through Casino Square, I closed a half a second. The crowd's roar penetrated even the storm's fury. 20,000 voices united in disbelief at what they were witnessing. In the Toleman pit, I could imagine Alex Hawkridge gripping the timing screen, his knuckles white, afraid to breathe lest the break whatever spell was carrying his unknown driver toward Formula One immortality. But I was no longer thinking about the crowd, the pit, or even the championship implications of what was happening. I had entered a state of consciousness I had never experienced before, where the boundary between driver and machine, between human intention and physical reality, had dissolved entirely. The Toleman wasn't responding to my inputs. It was anticipating them, moving before I even formed the thought to move. Through the harbor chicane, Alain's line was defensive but not desperate. He knew I was there, could sense the presence in his mirrors of something that shouldn't exist. A Toleman running faster than his McLaren should have been impossible by every law of automotive physics and Formula One politics. Yet here we were, separated by mere meters and the thin line between the possible and the miraculous. I could feel his confusion radiating through the spray. Alain was a man who solved racing like mathematical equations, who reduced every variable to calculable risk. But what was happening behind him couldn't be calculated. It could only be experienced, and experience was teaching him that sometimes the universe rewrites the rules without asking permission. The gap closed to 0.3 of a second, close enough that I could see his helmet movements, could read the tension in his shoulders as he glanced repeatedly in his mirrors. The professor was encountering a problem his textbooks hadn't covered. What to do when the impossible stops being theoretical and starts gaining on you at 2 seconds per lap. Through to back, where the barriers lurked like concrete predators, I found a line that existed in the space between physics and faith. The outside edge of the track, where standing water should have sent me spinning into oblivion, had become my sanctuary. The Toleman carved through the corner with precision that defied every law of wet weather driving, closing the gap to 0.2, then 0.1. I was breathing differently now, not the sharp, controlled breaths of concentration, but something deeper, more rhythmic, as if my entire cardiovascular system had synchronized with the engine's pulse. The rainimer in my helmet had become a metronome, keeping time for a performance that was being conducted by forces beyond my understanding. Lap 28. The moment arrived, not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of destiny fulfilling itself. Coming out of the tunnel, where the track opened slightly before the chicane, I saw it, a gap that would exist for perhaps 2 seconds, requiring a commitment that went beyond courage and entered the realm of pure faith. Alain, following his perfect calculated line, moved slightly right to set up for the chicane entry. Standard procedure, optimal racing line, precisely what any driving instructor would teach. But in that instant, as his McLaren shifted position, physics and opportunity aligned in perfect harmony. I moved left. Not the decision to move left. There wasn't time for decisions. I simply found myself moving left, the Toleman responding to intentions that bypassed my conscious mind entirely. The outside line, where narrational driver would attempt an overtake in these conditions, where standing water waited to punish any mistake with immediate and dramatic consequences. Time dilated. What happened in the next 3 seconds felt like an hour of crystalline perception. I could see every droplet of spray, individual and distinct, could feel every subtle vibration transmitted through the steering wheel, could hear the exact pitch of my engine note changing as the turbo spooled up for maximum attack. The Toleman bit. Where it should have slid, it gripped. Where it should have lost traction, it found purchase that seemed to defy the laws of adhesion and physics. We pulled alongside the McLaren, 2 cars separated by 18 inches, and the difference between human perfection and whatever lay beyond human limitation. I could see Alain's helmet turn toward me, could imagine his eyes widening behind his visor as the impossible materialized beside him. The Toleman, the backmarker car that shouldn't have belonged on the same track, was not just matching his pace, but exceeding it, finding speed in conditions where speed shouldn't exist. The chicane entry rushed toward us like a closing door. 2 cars, 1 racing line, and a decision that would be made not by conscious thought, but by whatever force had been guiding me through this transcendent afternoon. The crowd noise reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of Monaco, 20,000 voices witnessing the exact moment when legend stopped being potential and became reality. I held my line. The commitment was absolute, irreversible, demanding faith that went beyond anything I had ever asked it of myself. If I was wrong, if the grip wasn't there, if physics reasserted its dominance, we would both end up in the barriers. The race over, the miracle extinguished in twisted metal and shattered dreams. But I wasn't wrong. The Toleman carved through the chicane on a line that shouldn't have existed, finding traction where traction had no right to be, maintaining a speed that made the McLaren look pedestrian. We emerged from the complex with me ahead. Not by much, maybe half a car length, but ahead. The crowd erupted. The sound was beyond applause, beyond cheering. It was the collective voice of humanity recognizing that they had witnessed something that transcended sport and entered the realm of pure wonder. Through my radio, I could hear Pat's voice, barely coherent. "Holy, Ayrton, you're leading. You're actually leading." But I barely heard him. I was existing in a space beyond normal consciousness, where the Toleman had become an extension of divine will, where every input, every correction, every perfect line through the impossible conditions was being orchestrated by forces that operated beyond human understanding. Lap after lap, I pulled away from Alain, not gradually, not carefully, but with the inexorable precision of destiny fulfilling itself. The gap grew to 1 second, then 2, then 3. Behind me, the greatest wet-weather driver of our generation was discovering what it felt like to be outclassed, not by superior technology or tactics, but by something that existed in the space between human potential and divine intervention. In the McLaren pit, I could imagine the chaos. Engineers checking their data, convinced their equipment was malfunctioning. Ron Dennis staring at timing screens that showed his world champion driver, in the most sophisticated Formula One car ever built, being systematically demolished by a Brazilian kid in a car assembled on a budget smaller than their hospitality expenses. But the real revolution wasn't happening on the timing screens. It was happening inside me, in the gradually dawning recognition that I had moved beyond the boundaries of normal human performance and touched something that existed in a realm where miracles weren't miraculous but inevitable. The rain continued to fall, but I was no longer driving through it. I was dancing with it, each corner a perfect note in a symphony of physics and faith that was being conducted by forces beyond my comprehension. The Toleman responded to thoughts I hadn't fully formed, to racing lines I could see but couldn't explain, to a rhythm that seemed to be emanating from the very heart of the storm itself. For seconds ahead now, 5, 6. What had started as an impossible dream was becoming an unstoppable reality, each lap confirming what some deeper part of me had always known, that sometimes the universe conspires to create perfect moments, and those moments don't ask permission before rewriting every rule we thought we understood. Through my mirrors, I could see the field spreading out behind me, a procession of the world's greatest drivers learning hard lessons about the difference between talent and transcendence. Cars worth millions soft dollars, designed by teams of engineers, piloted by champions, were being left behind by whatever force had taken control of this rain-soaked afternoon in Monaco. But even as I pulled further ahead, even as the impossible became inevitable, I could sense something changing in the atmosphere around the circuit. Radio chatter was increasing. Urgent conversations between race control and team principals whispered concerns about conditions that had moved beyond dangerous and into territory that had no precedent in Formula One history. The storm was reaching its peak, and somewhere in the comfortable offices overlooking the harbor, men in suits were beginning to ask questions about liability, about safety, about whether what they were witnessing should be allowed to continue. I was approaching perfection, touching something divine, experiencing racing as it existed in the realm of pure possibility. But perfection, I was about to learn, made some people very uncomfortable indeed. The gap continued to grow, but so did the whispers from race control. And in the space between transcendence and politics, between miracle and mundane human concerns about risk management, these seeds of tragedy were already being planted. 12 seconds. I was leading by 12 seconds in conditions that should have made leading by 12 attempts impossible. The Toleman had become something beyond mechanical engineering. It was pure intention made manifest, responding not to steering inputs, but to thoughts, to the rhythm of my heartbeat, to the sacred mathematics of perfect racing lines that existed only in the space between the physical and the divine. Behind me, the greatest drivers in the world were struggling simply to survive. Alain, the master himself, was fading in my mirrors like a ghost, his yellow helmet barely visible through the spray and rain that had become my natural element. The gap wasn't just growing, it was becoming an insurmountable chasm that separated mortal driving from whatever realm I had entered. The crowd was beyond hysteria now. Through the storm, through my helmet, through the engine noise and the hypnotic drumming of rain, I could feel their collective amazement washing over the circuit like a physical force. 20,000 people witnessing the impossible, their voices united in recognition that they were seeing something that would be talked about for generations. But in race control, a different conversation was taking place. "This is getting out of hand," came a voice over the radio frequencies that bled into our team channel. I couldn't identify the speaker, but the tone was unmistakable. Establishment concern, the voice of men in suits who measured risk in insurance premiums and political ramifications rather than in moments of transcendence. "The conditions are beyond what we've ever allowed before," another voice added. "Visibility is essentially zero. We're one mistake away from a tragedy." A tragedy, as if what they were witnessing wasn't already a tragedy of a different kind. The systematic dismantling of everything Formula One represented about hierarchy and natural order. The big teams, with their millions in development budgets and armies of engineers, were being humiliated by a Brazilian kid in a car that cost less than their catering expenses. Lap 32. 15 seconds ahead now. I was no longer racing against other drivers. I was racing against time itself, against the growing chorus of voices in race control, against the political forces that always emerge when the impossible becomes inconveniently real. Through Casino Square, where I had found that first magical line hours ago, the Toleman danced through standing water that should have been treacherous but had become my sanctuary. Every corner revealed new secrets, new possibilities, new proof that when human potential aligns with divine intention, the normal rules of physics become suggestions rather than laws. But the radio chatter was intensifying. "Ron Dennis is demanding we stop this," I heard someone say. The McLaren team principal, watching his world champion driver being systematically destroyed by forces he couldn't calculate or counter. He says the conditions are unconscionable. Unconscionable. That was one word for it. Another word might be miraculous. But miracles, I was learning, made certain people very uncomfortable. Ferrari's backing him up, came another voice. Maranello's on the phone. They want an immediate red flag. The red flag. The racing equivalent of divine interruption. The power to stop time itself and freeze whatever was happening on track. In normal circumstances, it was a safety measure, a way to protect drivers from conditions that had become genuinely dangerous. But these weren't normal circumstances, and I was beginning to understand that safety wasn't the primary concern driving these conversations. 18 seconds ahead. The gap was becoming astronomical, a mathematical impossibility that made a mockery of every assumption about competitive balance in Formula One. In the Toleman pit, Alex Hawkridge and the mechanics were standing transfixed, watching their timing screens like men witnessing the birth of a new religion. But their amazement was being overwhelmed by a growing sense of urgency, of something precious slipping away even as it reached its peak. I could feel it in the radio transmissions, in the subtle changes in the crowd noise, in the very atmosphere around the circuit. What had started as celebration was being infected by political calculation. The liability issues alone. Someone was saying over the radio, liability, insurance, risk management, the mundane concerns of bureaucrats and accountants, inserting themselves into a moment that existed beyond such pedestrian considerations. What was happening on track wasn't dangerous, it was transcendent. The only thing at risk was the establishment's comfort with its own assumptions about what was possible. Lap 35, 20 seconds. I was approaching a gap that would normally take half a race to build, accomplishing it in conditions where maintaining position should have been achievement enough. The Toleman was no longer touching the track. It was floating above it, carried by forces that existed in the realm where physics meets faith. Through to back, where the barriers waited with their usual malevolent patience. I found a line so perfect that the car seemed to be guided by invisible hands. Not my hands. Something far more capable. Something that understood racing at a level that transcended human knowledge and entered the territory of pure instinct. But even as I experienced this automotive nirvana, I could sense the gathering storm of political intervention. The radio frequencies were alive with urgent conversations, heated discussions between race officials and team principals, between safety coordinators and insurance representatives, between the guardians of established order and the forces of divine disruption. "We have to stop this," came a voice with unmistakable authority. "The conditions have deteriorated beyond acceptable parameters." Acceptable parameters. As if transcendence could be measured by bureaucratic standards, as if the miraculous was subject to committee approval. What was happening to me, what I was experiencing in perfect harmony with the Toleman and the storm, existed beyond parameters and in a territory that bureaucrats weren't equipped to understand. 22 seconds ahead. The gap was becoming a statement, a declaration that sometimes the universe selects individuals to demonstrate the difference between what we think is possible and what actually becomes possible when every variable aligns in perfect harmony. But the voices from race control were reaching crescendo pitch now. Urgent discussions about liability and safety, about the political implications of allowing this unprecedented demonstration to continue. The big teams were applying pressure, invoking safety concerns that sounded noble but carried the unmistakable undertone of wounded pride. Then I saw it, a marshal at Tobacco Corner, waving a red flag with the mechanical precision of bureaucratic intervention. Not because conditions had worsened. If anything, I was finding more speed with each lap, but because what I was accomplishing had become too politically inconvenient to allow. The red flag, the symbol that would forever represent the moment when transcendence met politics and politics won. When human achievement reached its absolute peak only to be cut down by the comfortable mediocrity of institutional protection. I brought the Toleman into the pits, the engine still singing its song of perfect harmony, the car still responding like an extension of divine will. But the spell was broken, the moment shattered by forces that operated in boardrooms rather than on racing circuits. The garage fell silent as I climbed from the cockpit. 22 seconds ahead, leading the Monaco Grand Prix. The impossible made manifest, only to be stolen by men who measured miracles in insurance premiums. I pulled off my helmet, and the silence was deafening. Not the silence of disappointment, but the silence of recognition. Everyone present understood they had witnessed something that existed beyond normal human achievement, something that would be talked about long after the bureaucrats who ended a tour forgotten. Pat approached first, his face a mixture of awe and outrage. Ayrton, you were that was. He struggled for words adequate to what he had witnessed. That wasn't driving. That was something else entirely. Something else entirely. That captured it perfectly. For 35 laps, I had transcended every limitation I understood about racing, about physics, about the boundaries of human potential. I had touched something divine and proven it was accessible to anyone willing to surrender completely to forces beyond rational understanding. Alex Hawkridge joined us, his usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled emotion. 22 seconds, he said, his voice carrying wonder and fury in equal measure. In these conditions, to eye in our car. They stopped you because they were afraid of what you were proving. What I was proving. That hierarchy was illusion. That expensive machinery was no match for pure intention. That sometimes the universe selects moments to demonstrate possibilities that exist beyond our comfortable assumptions about limitation and order. The rain continued to fall, but I was no longer dancing with it. The partnership between man, machine, and divine intention had been interrupted by men who confused safety with comfort, who mistook transcendence for danger, who couldn't distinguish between the impossible and the inevitable. Later, they would declare Alain the winner, awarding victory to the man who had been systematically demolished by forces he couldn't comprehend. The record books would show his name, not mine. History would be written by committees rather than by the universe itself. But everyone who witnessed that afternoon in Monaco knew the truth. They had seen a 24-year-old Brazilian touch something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human achievement. They had watched transcendence interrupted, divinity cut short by bureaucratic intervention, the impossible made briefly manifest before being returned to the realm of dreams. That day, I lost my first Monaco Grand Prix, but I gained something far more valuable, the absolute certainty that human potential, when aligned with divine intention, could accomplish anything. The red flag could stop the race, but it couldn't erase what had been proven in those 35 laps of perfect harmony between man, machine, and miracle. They called it safety. I knew it was fear. Fear of what had been demonstrated, fear of what it meant for established order, fear of the moment when the impossible stops being theoretical and starts gaining 22 seconds per race distance. The world had seen Ayrton Senna that day, not just the driver, but the force of nature that operated beyond normal human limitations. And though they could steal the victory, they could never steal the truth of what had been revealed in the rain-soaked streets of Monaco. Sometimes gods walk among us. Sometimes they're interrupted, but they're never forgotten. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us bring more stories like this.